for everyone that might miss it. But hi, thank you for joining. My name is Sarah and I work with the Conservation Measures Partnership. And I'm excited to announce our current webinar for this week on framing nature-based solutions. That was part of our collaborative learning initiative this past year by Anissa Lawrence from Tierra, and I'll let her introduce herself in just a minute. But just quickly for some basic rules, we're going to allow you to ask questions throughout the presentation, but if you could do so just in the chat, that would be great. And I will read the chat questions out at the end. And then we'll ask you, if you want at the end, to unmute yourself and ask questions once the talk is finished, and also to share some of your experiences with nature-based solutions. So we're excited to hear from all of you, but I'll hand it over to Anissa.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, everybody. I'm Anissa Lawrence. I'm the Managing Director of Tierra, based in Sydney. So it's very early here, but it's good to be here. So I'll just go through and just give you a little bit of background on us. So this is Jess and I are the team that undertook this piece of work. And Tierra is a small NGO where our mission is about building resilient communities to reverse nature loss by helping to unlock transformational change. And we focus mostly across the Coral Triangle, Australia and the Pacific. That's sort of that Southeast Asia Pacific region is our area, and our focus is on unlocking these new and innovative thinking and approaches and collaborations, fostering change makers for tomorrow, and helping to enable community-led action on the ground at the scale and speed needed. So nature-based solutions is a core focus of what we work on and do. So what we were asked to do is to look at the value of nature-based solutions as part of the learning initiative. And so we sought to understand the value in terms of achieving cost-effective benefits for biodiversity, climate, and society. We applied a collaborative learning approach to how we did it. So it was a desktop review with a number of interviews of stakeholders, of key people that work in the nature-based solution space, mostly from the CMP members, but also from outside there. Just so you're aware, it was a very short piece of work. We had 4 months in total to do the work. So it was really 3 months of interviews and desktop reviews and so on, and then the rest of the time was spent writing it up. But we did try and get as broad a cross-section of projects and different parts of the geographies in the world and so on to try and make it worthwhile. So there was 5 key questions that we looked at, and I'll go through and talk about what we found in relation to each of these in a second. So first of all, what makes nature-based solutions different from other approaches that's been used by the conservation community in the past? So things like integrated watershed management, sustainable development approaches, ecosystem-based adaptation, and so on. We looked at what are the benefits, or maybe not, of framing something as a nature-based solution. What evidence is there that they're delivering benefits, biodiversity, climate, for example, at a large or a small scale? And what are the conditions, the enabling conditions, where they tend to work or not? We were asked to look at whether there's examples of cost-benefit analysis to show that NbS are efficient and effective alternatives to addressing societal challenges instead of perhaps engineered solutions through grey infrastructure. And then we looked at generic theories of change and what could be used as a starting point in that response. I'm not going to talk about the theories of change today, that's covered in the report, but I'll cover the first 4 questions. So firstly, just to kick off so everybody is on the same page, I thought it might be good to just explore what is nature-based solutions first. And basically, they're based on the idea of you have an ecosystem approach and intended to complement, mediate the negative impacts, or even replace technological or engineered type approaches to deal with the changes of society. So challenges of society. So there's IUCN brought out the global standard for nature-based solutions in 2020, it went through a very rigorous scientific-based process to pull it together, and it really does give us globally a very rigorous and reliable framework for designing and implementing, as well as evaluating nature-based standards. And it really is the framework, if you like, for how we for what we used for this project when we were talking to people. So the definition that IUCN give to this, to nature-based solutions, is that they're actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges, so things like food security, disaster risk reduction, livelihood improvement, climate change adaptation, those sorts of things, effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And that co-benefit component is really, really important in as you'll see in the findings from talking to people. The thing to note though is that nature-based solutions is really just an umbrella concept that covers a wide range of different ways and types of nature-based solutions. So you've got everything from protection type projects right through to restoration. But it's really about having the challenges of society at the center of what you're doing, understanding what the priorities of a community are, or of a region that you're working in, and then using the natural environment and some sort of ecosystem-based approach that fits that context to deliver human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So some examples of nature-based solutions, and these are just from the IUCN standard, but and I won't go through all of them, but just to give you an idea. So where you might have an agro-business investing in landscape restoration techniques with smaller farmers to ensure there's a healthy long-term supply chain, where you've got urban planners protecting or restoring a nearby forest that's crucial to the city's water supply, community planting mangroves, coastal trees, and so on, to help buffer storms, provide coastal protection from sea surge and so on, from storms and sea level rise, or an engineering construction type company planting trees or mangroves as part of a new bridge roadway project to help protect the infrastructure, which will reduce the maintenance and increase the lifespan of the infrastructure. So there's a whole lot of different examples, but that's just a couple. So what I thought I'll do is I'll just share the findings from the consultation process that we went through. The desktop review is pretty in-depth and there's a lot of information in the report. I'll touch on that where it's relevant, but I thought it was more important to share the findings and experiences of what people were telling us and where the current situation is. And for those of us who work in the NBS space, you would know that it's a really fast-moving beast, if you like, at the moment. There is so much going on. There's so much interest in it. It's almost seen as the panacea for the next great silver bullet, and it's actually not a silver bullet, but it is being, I guess it's the latest thing at the moment, and donors are very interested as a result. And so it's really important that we're doing this piece of work to try and understand what is it, what isn't it, how we should go about it, and will it actually deliver the impact that everybody thinks it will. So in terms of the recognition, there's definitely a recognition amongst the conservation sector and from governments and donors that the old way of doing conservation is not necessarily getting us to where we need to be at the scale and speed required. And when you look at the pressures from climate change and the huge biodiversity loss that's happening globally, it's really pushing governments and international authorities and some of the big NGOs to reconsider how they do things and to think about, is there a better way? And nature-based solutions is actually providing this opportunity to try and take a more integrated approach. So it gives an opportunity to unite around a common approach where you've got explicit criteria and indicators, so you can measure multiple co-benefits for the first time. So not just the biodiversity, but also the social. And so it's a more comprehensive, broad, sort of holistic approach to nature conservation and sustainable development at scale. So it really provides or encourages this integrated approach to how we undertake conservation, so that we're looking at dealing with the priorities of a community, working on poverty alleviation, food security, disaster risk reduction, all those sort of things, and at the same time trying to get conservation benefits and biodiversity outcomes in the process. So in a rural setting or in developing countries, nature-based solutions provides a really broad-based approach and the multiple co-benefits that can actually bring sustainable change and go beyond a short-term project cycle, which is very common, particularly in the small island developing states where I work, and help fuel the green-blue economy growth that these countries or in areas are seeking. In an urban or developed setting, it's a little bit different, but it actually provides natural alternatives to grey infrastructure, so you do get the co-benefits to biodiversity and communities, and it also helps foster people's connection to nature, which in the cities is something that is dramatically being lost with all our move to online and just spending all our time in front of screens. There was some caution raised from the people we spoke to around the terminology and the narrative when we talk about nature-based solutions. And what's happening is that many people are coming up with their own definition or what they see as a nature-based solution. And as I said, it is an umbrella concept. It does cover many different contexts and approaches, but this twisting or changing of the definition away from the IUCN definition as sort of the benchmark potentially creates risks around scope creep, concept fatigue and confusion, particularly in the region where I work in the Pacific. There's a lot of confusion and concept fatigue where they've had, this is the thing you need to do for years and years, and then a new concept comes along. No, this is what we need to do, and now this is what we need to do. And so keep continuing to change the definition and push different things really does create some risks. And if projects are poorly designed or the concept is misused, it can lead to perverse outcomes and potentially greenwashing as well. So people talk to us about the need for clarity on a conceptual starting point. So it's nature-based solutions for what? What are we using it for? And to be really clear, at least in terms of what the starting point is. And it was interesting, some NGOs are using it for climate mitigation. They see it as a way for that with co-benefits. Others are focusing on resilience and adaptation or food security or whatever it might be. But everyone was really clear that you need to understand nature-based solutions for what. As I said, there's been really rapid adoption of the NBS approach among NGOs and governments and development agencies. And I guess that's great, but it does come with a risk in losing control of the concept, and potentially in the corporate sector by adopting NBS language when they're actually not delivering it. And so there's this potential for greenwash, where companies are getting on the bandwagon because it looks good, but what they're doing actually might not provide those co-benefits, and it might just be, really focused on one particular aspect, and it doesn't create that broad brush approach that we're looking for to address society's challenges. There's also coming through this temptation to see it as a quick fix, because nature-based solution approaches. So things like saying, well, we're just going to do mass plantings and monoculture to offset greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a nature-based solution, and it's a quick fix, and it's actually not about that at all, and that really doesn't create the biodiversity outcomes or to some extent those co-benefits at a local level. So just things to be wary of. Looking at NBS approaches with non-NBS approaches, there's three different frames, if you like, that we looked at for this. So you've got engineered approaches, which can have an immediate measurable impact to deal with sea level rise or storm surge or flooding or whatever it might be. They're particularly effective at reducing the impacts of specific hazards in the short term, but generally they're really expensive and they very rarely deliver co-benefits. but they will try and solve that specific hazard or issue that you're trying to fix. The NBS approach at the other end of the scale, I guess, looks at trying to provide a wide range of services, particularly ecosystem services. It offers protection from multiple hazards, which is important because hazards usually occur in isolation. It's about involving and benefiting local people, and it can be more adaptive to new conditions if you're letting nature sort of drive the outcomes for the process. It's less likely to create a false sense of security. However, it is less effective in the short term. These things take time, like it takes time to grow mangroves, it takes time for trees to grow and wetlands to be rehabilitated and so on. So it's something to be aware of, that it isn't a short-term solution, and that our expectations need to be that if we're going to do a nature-based solution project, we need to think about the medium to long term to measure the outcome, not just the short term, because we may not get measurable outcomes in that short term. It can require large areas of land depending on the scale that you're working, particularly if it's like wetland restoration and so on. And it may rely on ecosystems that are vulnerable to climate change, things like mangroves and seagrass and so on, that are all exposed and subject to sea level rise. The area where most people seem to be fitting is around these hybrid approaches, which is sort of a blend of the engineered and a nature-based approach to deal with challenges in society. So it's looking at intermediate, it's intermediate, I guess, in terms of effectiveness and affordability. It's sort of in the middle. It can bring positive consequences, so positive outcomes. And most people who have done these hybrid approaches have found positive outcomes from it. And it's slightly more beneficial, I guess, when you look at the co-benefits and all the factors considered if you're doing an assessment for what's required. So a hybrid approach is really starting to be seen as a really good blend to try and help deal with the short term if you've got flooding versus the long-term natural sort of management of flooding. As I said, there's been increased investor and donor interest in nature-based solutions, particularly in the last couple of years and very much since the COP over in the UK earlier this year. But I guess it's really about balancing donor expectations for short-term outcomes versus the recognition that nature-based solutions might only be realised in the medium to long term, as I was saying before. Donors generally want to see, outcomes within sort of like 3 to 5 years, and it may take longer to get that with nature-based solutions. Not saying we shouldn't do them, but it's something to be aware of. What we did find from talking to some donors, as well as some of the big NGOs that are working with donors, is that some of the donors, I guess, are not clear or not giving sort of clear guidance, or are not clear themselves as to what they want to see from nature-based solution implementation. And so I guess there's this risk that if the donors are not clear in terms of what they're looking for, but they think it would be something good to do, they're relying on NGOs and others to sort of guide them in terms of the where things will end up. And so there's a risk that we could get short-term, the focus is on short-term gains or the low-hanging fruit, rather than looking at the big picture and the end game that we're seeking. In terms of the NBS climate change financing that's happening at the moment, it was really clear that the focus needs to be on quality rather than volume of investment. Making sure that the way the money is invested actually will deliver the co-benefits and the outcomes that are being sought. And that led to this need to be able to demonstrate value for money. Nature-based solutions is a pathway to being able to demonstrate that, but it takes time, and you don't necessarily see that value for money in the short time frame. And so as a result, the NGOs we spoke to really encourage, and the donors also really encourage, working closely with donors to try and help reach consensus and have really clear objectives and guidance in terms of nature-based solutions for what and how they want that to be achieved is important. So we did a bit of a snapshot from just some of the different benefits that are and the concerns that are raised. The benefits are green, the concerns are red. And what was clear that it has implications for almost every aspect of activity in conservation and development sectors. And so, as I was talked about before, it's bringing this integrated approach. So what we're starting to see is that the development sectors, not just the conservation sectors, are now looking at nature-based solutions as potential opportunities for trying to deliver food security, poverty alleviation, and so on. So in terms of benefits, people are seeing that, I guess there's nothing enlightening here. It's like any really well-run project, but it's about empowering communities to be able to drive change. It does allow this involvement beyond the environment sector, and I guess that's the main difference compared to some of our traditional ways for doing conservation. Landscape scale impact is also another one. The IUCN standard provides this clear indicator framework, monitoring and evaluation framework, and it's very bankable for donors and so on because of the benefits to community and the benefits to biodiversity that are possible. At the other end, I guess some of the concerns that were being raised is, is this just a trend and we're waiting for the next big trend to come through? Making very clear that it's not a substitute for emission reduction. If we're trying to use nature-based solutions for climate change, we can't just see it as the one-stop shop that will fix a climate change solution, because it won't. We need to be focused on reducing fossil fuel emissions first and foremost, and there is a role for nature-based solution, but it's not the be-all and end-all to dealing with the crisis that we're in. There was concern raised with lack of capacity within governments, particularly small island developing states, around their ability to be able to sort of take on more concepts and try and drive change through policy and so on. So I guess some people are operating outside their area of expertise, particularly if you're in the development sector and you haven't worked on biodiversity outcomes before. There's that risk that you may not, unless you've got good advice or you're partnering with a conservation NGO, you really are operating outside your area of expertise. Resistance to change within organisations to move to this integrated approach. So a number of the people we spoke to were actually managing a transition of their current projects to a nature-based solution focus. And that was based on the co-benefits that they could see from doing that. And so I thought I'd just share some of the findings from those discussions, because it was quite interesting in terms of what people were saying. So internally, some of the big NGOs have resistance in pockets because technically it's actually not a new concept. It could just be a new buzzword or a trend, because ecosystem-based adaptation, all those sorts of things we've talked about in the past, they all fit under nature-based solutions. It's just that it now provides this integrated framework and a way to measure the outcomes of what we're doing in a considered and more systematic way. It's more systems thinking approach. Others viewed the change as just a maturation of previous approaches, so we've just moved forward in that regard. There was good discussion on needing to develop internal consistency and overcoming misconceptions, and that came back to organisations having a clear definition of what do they mean about nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions and so on when they talk about them internally, as well as with government agencies and so on, because it can mean different things to different people unless that definition is really clear. And leading to that, I guess it raises different levels of expectation. So it's about getting everybody on the same page. A number talked about that using the IUCN self-assessment tool that they've developed for nature-based solutions as a way to design and evaluate current projects that you want to transition to nature-based solutions, and looking at them in the context of the 8 criteria that the nature-based solutions standard from IUCN provides, and these are the criteria here. So it's I guess benchmarking your project to these criteria helps you sort of determine where you might have gaps or fall short in terms of it being sort of a full nature-based solution project. So everything from addressing societal challenges, the design is being informed by the scale, it's economically viable, it's based on an inclusive, transparent and empowering governance process. It's being managed adaptively based on evidence and so on, the sustainable, mainstreamed within appropriate jurisdictional contexts and so on. So those criteria really provide a useful framework. In fact, just as an example, one of the CMP members talked about they went through a self-assessment process, and they talked about that it was a really valuable opportunity that promoted internal discussions on programmatic strengths and weaknesses. And it subsequently led to a refinement of activities in a range of things that they did. And they said it actually has increased the confidence in their approach. So because it evolved their thinking by benchmarking themselves to the standard. So it just gave them a confidence, if you like, because the increased knowledge about particular issues and so on, and the fact that it was very measurable, just allowed you to have more flexibility, I guess, to have a direct change, to be able to measure direct change to impact on the ground is what they saw as valuable. Some of the lessons learned that are coming through from those transitioning to nature-based solution projects or are designing new ones and implementing new ones now is that really at the end of the day, this is nothing new. It's just about the nature-based solution standard. If you use that standard as the frame from which to work, it's really just about best practice on-ground project management and providing an improved framework for planning and measuring. There's no rocket science about it. It's really just about doing a really good job at managing projects. And I guess what was really clear around the importance of local knowledge and co-design is that if you want high quality nature-based solution projects, you need to go beyond just raising awareness with the community and getting community support to be involved in projects, to focusing on true participation and co-design of activities with community, and then co-production and implementation, and not just of the activities, but how you measure those activities through the indicators as well. What was really important was that governments and communities having the capacity and the opportunity to be able to drive the solutions based on their priorities and local knowledge. And that was really critical, rather than just applying the science. It was about blending. So that integrated, it's not just conservation and development, but it's traditional knowledge with Western science and so on to drive solutions and outcomes. So increasing organizational capacity for engagement and co-design on the ground and thinking about how to build and strengthen relationships was seen as really important. Expanding scope for stakeholder engagement beyond the usual suspects. So really encouraging for nature-based solution projects, these cross-sector relationships. So you're not just working with the conservation department and the climate change people and the communities on the ground, but you're working with tourism and infrastructure and maritime and fisheries and so on to look at how those cross-sector relationships can help address the issues. Building it at a realistic pace of change was really important. So these incremental development options, being aware of the local politics and social sensitivities, such as concept fatigue and resistance, was something really strongly that came out through many of the conversations that we had. And what that came down to was making sure that we're managing the expectations of the community. So because it is called nature-based solution, we don't want to necessarily create an expectation that it will solve all the problems, because we spoke to NGOs where the nature-based solution actually wasn't successful because of a whole lot of externalities that they didn't foresee in terms of how quickly climatic changes happened in the landscape, and the expectations had been created in the community that we were going to do all these things, and then they couldn't happen. So being able to be realistic about how long things will take, what's actually possible, what the risks are, is something really important. But again, you know, that's just good project management when you're working with communities, and managing the trade-offs between working at scale and localized ownership as well. Land tenure came up a couple of times in discussions, depending on where people were working, in that it was really important to understand who has decision-making authority, ensuring that there is local support of communities and decision makers before you go ahead, and understanding who owns or has a direct say over land and other resources. And when it was nature-based solution is on public land, it was people indicated that it's really important to understand that you might go and seek expert advice, but the government doesn't necessarily need to listen to it, and they won't necessarily incorporate that into decision making, which can influence processes and the ability to adaptively manage outcomes. Human rights, justice and inclusion came up in the context of nature-based solutions as well. So safeguarding and ensuring human rights, benefits to communities are at the heart of nature-based solution project design. So making sure that there's effective engagement with Indigenous people with their free and prior informed consent processes, ethical use of Indigenous and traditional knowledge, and understanding whose voice is marginalised when you frame something as a nature-based solution. Who do you leave out? And making sure that you have that inclusive approach to how you design the project, and that they're involved in that co-design process as well. It was also raised, I guess, working with the corporate sector, given there is a lot of interest in the corporate sector now around nature-based solutions, that inappropriate partnerships with government and the private sector can lead to greenwashing, and it does tarnish those involved in trying to, you know, have a genuine attempt at using nature-based solutions appropriately. And again, it raises those community expectations and can lead to a loss of trust, which is the last thing you want. From monitoring and evaluation, what people found most useful is that the strong monitoring system that the IUCN standard, where it's used, provides, allows for early detection and a rapid response to problems and unintended consequences, but also the ability to capture benefits and outcomes early. So even though you may not get a lot of evidence of outcomes in the short term, you can start to capture some of the benefits that are starting to be seen. But it was important to note, you know, it's needed for building that evidence base, and being able to use that monitoring and evaluation system as a way to identify interventions that are inappropriate or ineffective in a particular context, it's almost, you know, real time, if you like, so that you can adjust and amend and redirect your project accordingly. Using strong metrics for biodiversity and the socioeconomic factors reduce the risk of focusing too narrowly just on financial results or carbon credits, so that when, you know, it tries to help prevent the perverse outcomes by just looking at if it's all about carbon as opposed to those co-benefits that we talked about before. But then at the same time, if you're too broad with the focus of a project, you might, you know, get that scope creep or dilution of effort, which can reduce the overall impact. From the perspective of what are the enabling conditions for successful nature-based solutions, there was 5 key things that people raised. First of all, having capacity building and training for key decision makers to enable co-design process to be effective was really important, particularly in those small island developing states, and doing it in a way where you manage that concept fatigue and just the overloading of people, because there's only so few people in you know, the different departments in small countries, and they're trying to take on all this stuff, particularly when there's GCF money and JEF money and you name it, donors everywhere throwing money at this process, and everybody wants to get on board. Breaking down the silos to enable a more whole of government approach was seen as really key. And this is this inclusive sort of integrated way of systems thinking, if you like. So, I mean, we all know that governments work in silos, but for nature-based solutions to be really effective, we need to move out of just the environment space and lift it up to across sectors. So starting to work at other sectors and starting to look at how a whole of government shift in thinking can drive long-term sustainable outcomes, that protect biodiversity and their communities to deal with the challenges that people are facing. So this integrated long-term thinking into policy and regulatory frameworks was seen as really key, trying to ensure that you're building in nature-based solution thinking into development policies and plans for countries and so on. And we're actually working on a project at the moment that is, we're just in the design phase, looking at how we do that. And it's not easy. And it takes a lot of political will. And, we're looking at 20, 30-year timeframes rather than just 5 to 10 for this sort of stuff. It's about totally reframing how countries think about the environment and nature, as well as the outcomes they want for their communities. That cross-organisation, cross-sector collaboration is really key to avoid duplication and confusion, but also to make sure that you can get maximise the co-benefits, and having formalised targets for biodiversity and ecosystem health built into development plans was also seen as something really key. From the perspective of the cost effectiveness and impact of nature-based solutions, there's a fair bit of work going on in this space at the moment. And Oxford University has done a lot of work in this area. A couple of years ago, they looked at about 108 published studies that covered all sorts of intervention types that would fit under the nature-based solution umbrella, where ecological outcomes had been reported. And what they found is that 77 of those projects had positive outcomes, 4 had negative, and the rest were sort of mixed or unclear or had no effect. So, it doesn't really say an awful lot unless you go and read each project, but it's, I guess it's a start in trying to understand the impact. There's also, I guess, a few major studies or meta-analyses that have been done in the past few years as well. And they've tended to show positive impacts on societal challenges when you're looking at the challenges, climate change, development, and so on, as well as biodiversity conservation. Those analyses have shown that it is cost effective in comparison with largely technologically driven or grey infrastructure approaches, but the time frame needs to be considered, the short term versus the long term. But there was major gaps, I guess, remaining in bias in the evidence of these studies, because we've got more evidence in the north than we do in the south. And I guess most of the developing world is in the south. There was, I guess, a push. I mentioned before the engineering versus nature-based solution and the hybrid approach. And the hybrid approach does seem to be gaining traction, and the economic case is resonating with some of the international development agencies and those types of donors and governments. So hybrid approaches where you're combining non-structural interventions with grey infrastructure were most likely to result in strategies that will meet multiple management objectives in a cost-effective manner in that context, and in including providing ongoing employment. And that was one of the recent papers that's looked at this stuff. And the European Union also concluded that in cities, biodiverse nature-based solutions are highly adaptable to effectively respond to changing local conditions, and are often more cost and resource efficient than purely technological approaches. So there's a bit of work emerging, starting to show the cost effectiveness and the impact, but it's really too early to say, are they more cost effective, because these things take time. As I said, these are not 2 to 3 year projects. These are 5 to 10 year type scale projects that if we're going to do them well. And so we need to know, how long what the outcomes are over that medium to long term time frame. So for that reason, from a cost effective point of view, in the short term, it might look like they cost a lot, but when you look at it over the number of years and the ongoing benefit and the sustainability that comes from it, it might actually be more cost effective and you may get a better impact, but it's really too early for us to know. And it's also important to know that in many cases, the projects that are happening on the ground now, the ones that might be in transition, the monitoring systems were not set up to measure co-benefits. So there needs to be that retrofit process so you can go beyond just measuring biodiversity outcomes to those socioeconomic outcomes or vice versa. So this is the last slide. So in terms of the key recommendations that came out of our piece of work, our study that we did, and as I said, this was a 4-month study, so it was very quick. But in terms of key learnings and I guess the key messages and things to take on board, that if we're going to go down this path of using nature-based solutions as a common approach to how we do conservation, using this integrated sort of methodology, if you like, we really need greater coordination between practitioners and donors across all sectors, so conservation, development, and so on, with a focus on building capacity within the governments and the community where it's low. And I guess that leads to making sure that we've got really good collaboration between NBS practitioners to share knowledge, reduce competition for resources and duplication. I work in the Pacific. We're designing 2 nature-based solution programs at the moment. One is creating the enabling environment for regional scaling, and the other one is to deliver long-term embedding of nature-based solution thinking into how countries move forward, as well as then setting up an investment fund that will be able to help implement actions. And what we found just through the consultation process we've been going through, that every man and his dog, if you like, from a donor perspective, you know, unilateral countries as well as ADBs and World Banks and so on, are all wanting to bring money, significant money into the region without necessarily knowing what everybody else is doing. And we're starting to talk to everybody, realizing, oh, you want to do that as well, and you want to do that as well. Oh, look, we're all doing the same thing. Like, so it's really important in regions where you've got small island developing states, particularly, that there's good collaboration between practitioners, so you know about who's doing what, and you can share learnings and knowledge, you know, whether it's through communities of practice, you know, or whatever it might be. Having something like that is really key, in my view. Having a consistent approach to quantifying the co-benefits for communities and societies needed so that we can build this economic case for nature-based solutions and allow for scaling. As I mentioned, we're starting to get some, you know, some peer-reviewed literature coming out around the value and impact of nature-based solution, but we just haven't had the long-term ability to quantify those benefits. And so the economic case is still not very strong for encouraging long-term commitments of countries to, you know, to embed nature-based solution thinking into how they deal with flood events and sea level rise, you know, rather than just building a seawall, let's put in a hybrid seawall type situations. There's really a need for, because this is you're in it for the long haul, there's a need for early wins as a learning and engagement opportunity with stakeholders, and also as stepping stones to be able to see progress to the long-term goals. And finally, ongoing learning to understand the value from cross-sector nature-based solution developments. You know, we haven't had much experience up until now where conservation and development agencies have worked together on trying to deliver these co-benefits. And so I think having this ongoing learning process to try and understand that value from different sectors is going to be really key. So I'll leave it there and happy to take questions. And if you want to share your experiences in the chat, that would be really great as well. And I'll hand back to Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. We have 3 questions so far in the chat. If you have other questions, you can either feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you can do that as well. So the first is first a comment, very interesting yet worrying. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but seems like people keep getting caught by the next shiny thing. Are we doing nature-based solutions projects the minute we have both biodiversity and human well-being goals in our conservation standards projects?
Not necessarily. And I guess it depends on whether nature-based solution, that approach is going to suit what it is that you're trying to, what your outcome is that you're looking for. But it is, you know, people do tend to jump on the next big shiny thing, and there's a lot of money being thrown around for nature-based solutions because it is being seen as a way to try and help raise conservation up to us, you know, the scale and speed that we need outcomes. Because if you think about how things happen at the moment, you know, NGOs tend to work in their rural area for years and years and years, and it's really hard to scale because it's so expensive, because they're only focused on, you know, biodiversity outcomes or whatever it might be, whereas nature-based solutions, I guess, tries to frame things a little bit differently and give you a more integrated approach that can help you scale and deliver outcomes at a faster rate than if you just keep doing this community and this community in this community sort of thing, subject to your funding. So yeah, I don't think it's you know, as the conservation standards projects, I don't think it has to be a nature-based solution project, but it's certainly a really useful approach or umbrella suite of approaches to fit a certain context in a certain issue that you're trying to deal with.
Great. The next is, could you define greenwashing?
Oh, okay, sure. So greenwashing is where, and it's mostly in the corporate sector, where a corporate might make a claim that their product is sustainable or green, you know, a green type product, and when you actually dig a bit deeper, you find that it's just market, you know, smoke and mirrors, and it's a marketing communications messaging rather than having much substance behind it. So I guess in the corporate sector, there's a tendency around nature-based solutions for them to get on board because it is the next big shiny thing, and you know, fund some project to say that it's, you know, we're doing nature-based solutions when actually they're not, and it's just some sort of greenwashing marketing effort. So I guess from that perspective, it's really important to do due diligence on any corporate sort of government partnerships that you're entering into in this space.
Thank you. Next question is, thank you for bringing clarity to the nature-based solution space. NBS, as you mentioned, have many natural and human benefits, and I'm wondering if your report looked at metrics that can be used to evaluate outcomes. My organization is engaging with NBS Blue Carbon and are always thinking of ways we can better measure or describe human and natural aspects.
We didn't go into the metrics in too much detail, but the best place to look for them is in the nature-based solutions standard, which actually has, against those 8 criteria that I showed before, there's a whole bunch of metrics for each one of those, and looking at how they may, whether any of those are suitable. And from the blue carbon perspective, I guess it's looking at, you know, in terms of the methodologies and so on that countries are using, like Australia's just brought out its methodology. There's some metrics and so on at that level that may be useful to look at as well.
Did you map what is not an NBS? What conservation strategies would not fall under the NBS umbrella concept?
We did look at that, and I guess it's where you've got projects where you don't get co-benefits. So if you're just looking at biodiversity outcomes, then it doesn't necessarily fit under the nature-based solution umbrella. So it really does come down to what is not. So things like setting up a marine protected area purely for biodiversity outcomes is not a nature-based solution if there's no co-benefits to local communities and so on in terms of food security and livelihood improvement and so on as part of that process. Likewise, like the example I mentioned before, where you might have a corporate that plants out a monoculture of forest for reducing carbon emissions, but there's no co-benefits from a biodiversity outcome point of view because a monoculture doesn't necessarily help strengthen biodiversity in an area. So it really depends on the context and the situation, but it's about looking at whether you get those co-benefits. both for people and biodiversity. And if it's only one or the other, then you couldn't really say it's a nature-based solution. You really need both.
Great. I guess just following up on that one, how would you say NBS differs from the older concept of sustainable development?
To be honest, I actually don't think it differs very much. I think it helps mature the thinking around, you know, the three sort of legs of the stool, you know, social, economic, development, environment, and it actually gives us a tool to be trying to take that integrated approach, so you can try and drive outcomes in a way that gets you the socioeconomic and the biodiversity outcomes. So yes, I don't actually think it's very different. It's just a new, it's just a culmination of many years of many people thinking about this and trying to learn and understand what's worked and what hasn't. And you know, the IUCN standard is probably the best place that tries to put all that thinking into one place to provide this rigorous framework for how to do sustainable development. Effectively, that's what it is. So.
And another, this is our last one in the chat so far. So please, if you have more questions, we have about 8 minutes left. So put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand virtually or on your screen. So from James, these are my three main takeaways on NBS. More or less, what is more or less right, or what's missing. One, longer term investments for longer term change. Participation transforms into co-production of plans and co-benefits, and need longer term donor investment and evaluation.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Is there anything missing?
I guess that may, oh no, you've got co-benefits there, and I think that's pretty good in terms of trying to sum it up. Yeah, and I guess the scale is the thing that's missing, that this approach does provide opportunity for scale, because you're working over the longer term. You can sort of move beyond just the usual sort of project or number of communities to looking at landscape scale approaches to apply this to, which is not easy, but it you know, the methodology is there to be able to use to help to guide you to do it at that level. But otherwise, I think they're pretty spot on, James.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? Or would like to share their experience with NBS in their own work? Going once. Going twice. Okay. Well, then I'll call it there. And if you have any further questions in this, I feel like you just put you had your email up that whole time. But if you want to maybe put it in the chat for people to reach out to you with questions. I also put in the chat the link to the final report, which you can find both on the Conservation Standards main website and also on our workspace if you're interested in learning more. But thank you so much, Anissa, for your time and for talking with us this whole time. I really appreciate it. And everyone be on the lookout for the next webinar that's coming up. It'll be coming through the CMP and CCNet listservs and also on our social media. So thank you for coming.